Thank you all for braving this weather, although, as I understand it, last week might have been worse, so I probably picked the right week to be here. I might have been delivering this from the airport if we had done this last week. So I want to begin our story a little bit after the Civil War, on June 13th, 1905. It was less than 3 weeks before his death that John Milton Hay awoke in his cabin room on the RMS Baltic as the great ocean liner crossed or steamed a course from Liverpool back to New York. At this point, Hay was a noted poet and historian, a former newspaper editor and railroad executive. He had served as U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom. And since 1898, he had been the Secretary of State, first under President William McKinley, and then after his death, under President Theodore Roosevelt. By this point, Hay, who was well into his 60s, was arguably one of the most powerful men in the world. But his bright spirit was fast burning out a frail body. He reached for his diary and composed what I think he knew was one of its last entries. And he wrote, quote, "I dreamed last night that I was in Washington and that I went to the White House to report to the president, but the president turned out to be Mr. Lincoln. He was very kind and considerate and sympathetic about my illness. He gave me 2 unimportant letters to answer. I was pleased that this slight order was in my power to obey. I was not in the least bit surprised of Lincoln's presence in the White House, but the whole impression of the dream was one of overwhelming melancholy." And we can only imagine at this point how long it had been since Abraham Lincoln had faded into John Hay's dreams. Lincoln's Boys, the book that I've just published through Viking, which is part of the Penguin family, is the story of John Hay and John Nicolay, 2 prairie boys who met in 1851 and forged a close friendship that would endure over the course of a half a century. History basically, or fortune, found them at the right place and the right time, Springfield, Illinois, in 1860. And ultimately, it offered them a front row seat to one of the most tumultuous political upheavals in American history then or since. As Abraham Lincoln's private secretaries, Hay and Nicolay became both literally and figuratively closer to the president than anyone outside of Lincoln's immediate family. At the time, they were still young men in their 20s. They lived and worked on the 2nd floor of the White House, down the hall from the Lincoln family. And they performed the roles and functions of a modern-day presidential chief of staff, press secretary, political director, and presidential body man. Today, you probably have to spend 20 years moving up the ladder. They got to do all of those jobs in one. Above all, they did what one reporter called guarding the last door which opens into the awful presence, end quote, of the commander-in-chief. That was Noah Brooks, a journalist who was one of the many Washington insiders who coveted Hay and Nicolay's jobs, resented their influence, and certainly thought that they were a little too big for their britches. A fault, John Hay said, which seems to me to be blamed on either nature or our tailors. It was little wonder that historians consult Hay's and Nicolay's writings quite frequently, because they were really sparkling letter writers and diarists, and they provide an eyewitness account of Lincoln's White House. And so for this reason, most scholars of the Civil War era know Hay and Nicolay very well. They're used, we rely on them to help us document that period. It's actually their life's work after Lincoln died that's the unwritten story. The boys, as the president affectionately called them, became Lincoln's official biographers, enjoying exclusive access to his papers, which the Lincoln family actually closed to the public until 1947, which was the 21st anniversary of Robert Todd Lincoln's death and was well decades past the time when the principals involved, including Hay and Nicolay, had passed away. They undertook a quarter-century mission to create a definitive and enduring historical reputation for their slain leader. And the culmination of these efforts, an extensive 10-volume biography which was serialized widely between 1886 and 1890 in the Century magazine, which at that time was America's leading mass circulation magazine. That effort constituted one of the singularly successful exercises in historical revisionism in all of American history. Writing against a rising current of Southern apologia, Hay and Nicolay pioneered what some critics called the so-called Northern interpretation of the Civil War, But it was really their portrayal of Lincoln that became the standard against which every writer then and since has had to stake out a position. Hay and Nicolay actually helped to invent, or in many ways they did invent, the Lincoln whom we know today. The sage father figure, the military genius, the greatest American orator, the brilliant political tactician, the master of a fractious cabinet who forged a team of rivals, so to speak, out of erstwhile challengers for the throne. The Lincoln Memorial Lincoln. These are, in every sense, the invention, or at least the imagination that was left to us of Lincoln by Hay and Nicolay. Now, that Lincoln was all of these things, in some measure, there can be no doubt. He certainly was. But it's easy to forget, and we often do, how widely underrated Lincoln the president and Lincoln the man were at the time of his death, and how successful Hay and Nicolay were in elevating his place in the national memory. While Lincoln prided himself on his deep connection to the people, which is a phrase he used often, he never actually succeeded during his lifetime in translating that immense popularity with the Northern public into a similar sense of regard among the nation's political and intellectual elites, who continued to regard him poorly. The profound emotional bond that Lincoln shared with Union soldiers and with their families, and his stunning electoral successes in two presidential elections back-to-back never fully inspired the equivalent, an equivalent level of esteem among the influential men who governed the country and guarded its official history. And to many of these men, he remained in death what they described him as in life, the rail splitter and the country lawyer, good and decent, but ill-fitted to the immense responsibilities of the wartime presidency. Leading into the 1864 election cycle, for instance, many prominent members of Lincoln's own party would have agreed with one senator, a Republican, who said that this administration has been a disgrace from the very beginning to everyone who had anything to do with bringing it into power. And that was hardly an isolated point of view. From across the political spectrum, influential writers and politicians blamed Lincoln in 1864 for 4 years of military stalemate and setbacks, as well as for a series of political blunders that had cost the Republican Party dearly in the 1862 off-year elections. And those were his friends. Democrats, of course, particularly in the North, forget the South, regarded Lincoln as a tyrant, a man who introduced the draft, a man who introduced a whole host of taxes in order to fight this war, a man who freed the slaves and wanted to fight a war to free the slaves. Even after his martyrdom, the learned classes in the North continued to turn up their noses when Lincoln's name was mentioned. In 1872, Charles Francis Adams, who was the scion of a famous Massachusetts family, of course, he was the grandson and great-grandson, or the son and grandson of presidents, and he also had served in the Lincoln administration as minister to Great Britain, and before that as a Republican congressman. In 1872, Adams delivered a memorial address after the death of former Secretary of State William Seward, who had served under Lincoln. And he portrayed in this address, which was widely serialized, he portrayed Seward as the glue that kept the government together in perilous times. Reflecting common wisdom among the kind of learned classes of the day, he said, "I must affirm without hesitation that in the history of our government, down to this hour, no experiment so rash has ever been made as that of elevating to the head of affairs a man with so little previous preparation for the task as Mr. Lincoln." Now, this might have been a setup whereby he could have said, "But thank God it worked well and Lincoln was a terrific president." It's not what he said. He said, only by good grace and luck did Lincoln actually possess the wisdom to appoint as first minister Seward, the quote-unquote mastermind of the government and savior of the Union. Now, naturally, the speech enraged the Lincoln family. It enraged Lincoln's stalwart defense